Good morning. I'm Joan Denson, and I live here in Austin, Texas. Welcome to you all. We invite you into our spiritual community of open hearts and minds. Now, take a deep breath with me and release it as we ready our hearts and minds to enter this precious space to embrace what might be known and what remains a mystery as we consider stepping into the unknown. We light this candle to begin our service. And now, our opening reading. We live with uncertainty, beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers, to softer, more permeable aliveness, which is at every moment at the brink of death. Something new is being born in us, if we but let it. We stand in a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. We are honored and excited to have Flint Sparks back in our fellowships this morning. Flint is a Zen teacher and former psychologist dedicated to assisting people in the unending path of growing up and waking up. He is an experienced therapist and a master teacher who assists people in the skillful removal of blocks to love, both inside and outside. He is a clear and caring resource on the path of freedom from unnecessary suffering. Flint has nearly 4 decades of experience in the practice and teaching of psychotherapy. As a Zen teacher, he leads retreats throughout North America and Europe. Flint is joining us today from his home very early in the morning in Hawaii. Please welcome Flint Sparks.
Good morning, everyone. It is early here, just after 5 a.m., and altogether appropriate, I think, to come to you in the dark. I've lit up my space here, but our topic, stepping into the unknown, suggests mystery, as Joan just mentioned, and also together, walking together, kind of a pilgrimage. So I want to tell an old Zen story for a moment. It's one of those teaching stories from our tradition. A young monk was about to go on a pilgrimage, actually, and he was getting all his gear together. And because it was customary, this story is from China a long time ago, customary to go from temple to temple, monastery to monastery to learn from different teachers. And the senior teacher there saw him preparing himself and getting his staff and his pack and his hat, his sandals. And he said, where are you going? And the young monk said, I'm going around on pilgrimage. Then, being the good teacher that he was, he says to the young monk, well, what's the meaning of pilgrimage? And he said, I don't know. And the teacher said, yeah, not knowing is most intimate. Or another translation is, not knowing is nearest. So our spiritual life is to turn towards the not knowing and to find a home there and to find what it offers us. We get so caught in the known and have difficulty in the unknown. So I'm going to take you on a little pilgrimage today, about 2 miles from my home up the road. is a towering cliff looking down over the Kalaupapa Peninsula, where in the past was the home to what we would say in old parlance, a leper colony, the Kalaupapa home for people who had Hansen's disease and were placed there. And I'm going to take you there. If you'll take just a moment, technologically, it takes a moment to shift perspective. And I'm going to shift perspective now so I can take you on the pilgrimage with me. Are you there on the cliff with me now? Okay. Early in the morning, that's the peninsula, the colonies down below. It's below the tallest sea cliffs in the world. And what is possible, I think, in pilgrimage and possible in our spiritual practices together, as we open our hearts and minds, we can move into the day, each day, finding whatever light comes, and being astonished sometimes at what we step into. Those are beautiful and they're inspiring, and it was a clear morning. But some mornings are more mysterious and more challenging when we're stepping into the unknown. Whether we know there's a portal, we know our practices, our relationships, our community is helping us step forward. On one side is the possibility of light, on the other a storm, but there's an opening through which we're invited. And that's what happens here each Sunday, is that invitation to step into the unknown, that kind of pilgrimage. I offered the reading this poem by Anne Hillman, We Look with Uncertainty. My two friends in the picture there are down on the peninsula, actually, in that moment. We look with uncertainty. Beyond, it's interesting that when Joan read it, she read, we live with uncertainty.
Oh.
True. That's true. We look and we live with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers, which we want, to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which is every moment at the brink of death, and why it's a bit frightening. Something new is being born in us if we but let it. We stand in a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. So what those two friends of mine are looking at is that. That's where the ships brought the people who had been essentially kidnapped, who had Hansen's disease, leprosy, and that's where they were left in the Kalaupapa Peninsula to see if they could survive. They were taken away, left, and the community ended up developing. And there's the whole story of Father Damien coming and caring for them after a while. They're looking at this beautiful, beautiful landscape when something horrible happened. We were just speaking about that beautiful urban landscape of Manhattan and what happened, which we'll recognize tomorrow on September 11th. But looking at that, this quote I can't really get out of my head from John Tarrant, another Zen teacher, unkindness comes out of certainty. When we throw out certainty, we have the bare reality of consciousness. And another name for that is love. Unkindness comes out of certainty. When our views harden and our views narrow, unkindness, and we see this, unfortunately, on a great landscape, socially and politically right now. But we get open further, which is our pilgrimage today and our practices. Love is possible. Let's go back through the poem for a second. We look with uncertainty beyond old choices for clear-cut answers. On the horizon, we're not sure what's coming. We hope that it will be something good, but we're not always sure, and we can't always know. So there's this ambivalence and uncertainty that brings us vulnerability. And that vulnerability is what is opening always on the horizon. And we open to softer, more permeable aliveness, which is every moment on the brink of death. You'll see some of these photographs have tripods or cameras in them because people come here for contemplative photography retreats. And that moment when my friend Susan is not looking at the beautiful landscapes or the way the sun is rising, she's in that moment of awe. You can see the soft, permeable aliveness, which brings us closer to not only our own death, that's the big picture, but just the death, the passing of each moment. And this willingness to open to each moment, to feel its tremulous beauty, is called compassion. You might wonder why I have an image of a boat when I'm speaking about compassion. But we're all in the same boat. And knowing that opens our hearts and minds to what's possible and allows us the capacity to actually tolerate the unknowing that each moment invites us to. Something new is being born in us if we but let it. I'm standing down on the peninsula looking back up at the cliffs. It's not a particularly dramatic, in some ways, photograph, but you see that rainbow beginning to arrive. Something new is always arriving in our life because of the causes and conditions. The causes and conditions are ripe at that moment for this emergence of something, which actually isn't a thing. It's something beautiful and something unexpected. It's something mysterious that arrives because of the conditions. And that's every day, every moment of our lives in the same way. And where we're asked to understand as each moment arises and each moment passes away is a capacity for grief. The plaque that you see there, once a place of exile, is up on the cliffs, looking down on the peninsula. That instructs people who are visiting what they're seeing, what happened there, what the history was. And at that moment, when it had been raining and the sun came, but then it looked like tears to me. And without the capacity to grieve, we close down and we don't remain open to receive the possibility and the gift of each moment. And so it requires, or at least it invites, it doesn't require, but it invites our bearing witness. Often I take my students to the overlook in the morning so we can bear witness to what happened there. And we stand in silence from the dark moment like it is right now to the sun coming up, like some of those images that you saw. Last week, I had an afternoon when I had a lot of freedom. So I live in a very rural area on Molokai. It's a small island. There's only 7,000 people here, but we're part of Maui County. So I got in my little pickup and drove about 20 miles around to the east end of the island so I could sit on the shore and just see Lahaina across the channel. It's not that far. I couldn't see the details of every single thing, but you can see it. And I wanted to go there just to sit and listen to the waves coming up on the shore, feel the wind in my face, look across the channel, and just bear witness to what had happened there. That willingness to look, to not get caught in despair, but also not cover with a kind of a false hope, but to look with uncertainty and feel your own vulnerability is what our spiritual practices cultivate for us. But it requires that we're going to have to face grief. We stand in a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures. Like we don't remember that each moment, each breath is a new doorway. And life continues. And it takes some courage. I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't particularly want to engage in contemplative practices and wake up, because it's full of that sort of unknown mystery, even frightening. Daring to be human creatures, it takes courage to stand on the edge and to face what life is offering us and what it's asking of us in each moment. And the next line in that poem, vulnerable to the beauty of existence. Sometimes I think this is my favorite photograph I've ever taken. Not just because the little girl is so sweet, but there's something about looking in her back. It's not just a portrait, and her turning. And isn't this how our vulnerability comes? It's like it's coming from somewhere not full on it. And we can feel, and we turn, and out of the corner of our eye, we say, oh, now this. Now this. And then we turn to face life. And the next line in the poem, and it's part of our job as elders, I think, too, those of us that are older, is to teach how to love. Learning to love. And it's a lifelong process. I'm not talking about sentimentality or romanticism. I'm talking about the love that, what do we say in the scriptures, surpasses understanding, is beyond our conceptualizations. But as John O'Donohue once said, the great Irish poet, in the face of a human being, the absolute becomes embodied. We see the mystery. And this capacity is called wisdom, even though I'm talking about love, to be able to look that clearly. The woman who here, Celie, one of the photography students, she was the oldest person in our group that day. I don't know if you can't probably see close enough, her knee pads. And we were ready to leave that morning because, as you can tell in the photograph, the light was no good anymore. It was, the sunrise had happened, and we were ready to go, and the wind was howling and the waves were crashing. It was difficult to hear, and everyone looked around. It's like, where's Celie? And I said, I think I know where she is. So I went up this little hill, it was tucked away, and she's standing on the edge. She wasn't taking a photograph. She's leaning on her tripod because she's nearly 80 years old, being taken. Not taking a photograph, but being taken. And this is what our pilgrimage, our stepping into the unknown, asks of us. Do we have an open heart, compassion? Do we have the wisdom to look deeply, the willingness to meet the unknown and grieve each loss so that we can know what's arriving at the new doorway? Rilke said, love and death are the great gifts that are given to us. Mostly they're passed on unopened. This is in the cemetery, Father Damien's cemetery down in Kalaupapa. And in some ways, I think our spiritual practice is simply to know how to open to both the love and the inevitable losses that make life dear. And the way it is dear is because we hold on for dear life with each other. So the capacity is to learn to love and to keep our hearts open. Maybe we'd say the most defiant act in the face of death is the love for one person for another. To not close down, to continue to step into the unknown, and to care for each other. We do that, of course, in community. One of the interesting things about this photograph is, of course, I love the image of the beautiful dancers with their leis. But someone said they look like they're walking on water. Of course, it's just very shallow there. But you can see in some ways, the ordinariness. They're not performing. You can see them pulling the hair out of their face, looking at each other, looking down at the water, up the sky. This is us. And in some ways, it does allow us to walk on water. In that biblical story, the walking was to help someone, to bring someone up that was drowning. And that kind of care out of ordinary life is, I think, what our spiritual practices invite. So that when it's time to take that step, whatever it is, everything holds, and we're able to do so with our friends and for our friends. And we're able to actually step into the unknown. In our pilgrimage that we're taking, that step that you're seeing there is my good friend Suzanne, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin. She's another therapist, another Zen teacher, actually, who is engaged in her own pilgrimage with a life-threatening, progressive, and incurable blood cancer right now. But she's doing remarkably well and putting into embodied life all of these things that we're speaking about. And in some ways, we say stepping into the unknown, but there's one known that will always be there. The inevitability of losses. I remember the boat sitting quietly, the old blue rowboat that I showed you. Shunryu Suzuki, who was the teacher who developed over time the San Francisco Zen Center where I trained and was ordained. He said life is like it's like getting into a rowboat and rowing out into the middle of the lake, knowing it's going to sink. It sounds a little harsh or dark, but it isn't. We get into the boat and we row with all we've got in every kind of weather with our friends, knowing that there's only one destination. But that's what makes life so beautiful. So if we return to that early morning sun and those moments standing on the cliffs 2,000 feet above the Kalaupapa Peninsula, bearing witness. And sometimes our practices help us get a larger perspective so we can witness things deeply. We can wait for the new morning to come. In this case, Suzanne is walking into the sunset. But our hope and our work is so that the next morning can arrive. and with it a new dawn, a new possibility. The morning when I took this particular photograph, I was by myself at the overlook. It was extremely quiet, other than the wind through the trees coming up off of the ocean. And it was very still and very quiet, which is what we do in our meditation and contemplative practices. Just taking it in like Seeley was on those cliffs. And I noticed a movement out of the corner of my eye. And I turned very slowly, and deer were starting to come out of the forest. And they looked at me, and I looked at them, and nobody moved very much. And together we just shared those moments. And I think of us right now, even online together, showing up, looking, listening, stepping into the unknown, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. And so as I think of your name, the Open Hearts and Minds Fellowship, this seems to be an altogether appropriate journey to take, a pilgrimage of not knowing, so that we can, instead of know something with certainty, instead of believe in something, discover everything. And I think that that's our true pilgrimage. So I think that's probably enough walking about this morning. I'll shift back to this perspective, and I hope that this this walking and talking may have invited a question or a comment from anyone. We have a few minutes. If you can, I think you can raise your hand, click that little icon, and our tech people will help you.
So if you do have a question or a comment for Flint, use your reaction button on the bottom of the screen and click on that raised hand. It'll bring you to the top of the screen and make it easy for me to call on you. Please unmute when your name is heard.
There's Mike.
I see Mike Ignikowski's hand.
Yeah. Good morning, Flint. You were talking about learning how to grieve. And I was thinking about contrasting that to learning to accept the world the way it is. There's a teaching that a lot of suffering comes from inability to accept the world as it is, in particular, wanting permanence in face of inevitable change. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on contrasting learning how to grieve versus learning how to accept things.
They're the same thing. The accepting the fact that everything is impermanent allows us to know that we're going to have to grieve. I mean, grief also, I think everyone here is old enough to know that grief is just a form of love. We grieve because something's been lost, and we know everything can be lost. It's also how everything arrives. Without impermanence, nothing new happens. So accepting things as they are doesn't mean like, oh, well, that's the way it is. It means the willingness to see exactly the way things are rather than through our distorted lenses of our preferences, so we can respond appropriately. And seeing clearly is wisdom. Responding with an open heart is compassion. And those two are thought of as the two wings of a bird that allows us to move with life as it is, not because it's our preference. That's what we have to let go of. But it makes our life possible, and the other lives of other people possible, to be able to let go and let come.
Thank you, Flint.
Oh.
And Michael Johnson, I see your hand.
that ooh, wrong moment to have phlegm. I was really struck by the observation that certainty is the enemy of kindness, and so to take the next step, the enemy of love. Would you amplify on that for me, please?
Sure. I'm going to say something that may be a little unkind myself or provocative, but someone asked me the other day, was really pushing, what do you mean unkindness comes out of certainty? I said, just watch Fox News. There's a way in which, but equally, it could be, if you I come from a family that was, and I was raised Southern Baptist. My grandfather was a minister. I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist situation. There was much good that came from that. But there was also a lot of pain that came from the certainty of what's good, what's right, what's wrong, and who I was. I learned that I was wrong. And there was unkindness that came out of that certainty that things were a certain way. People were put in the Kalaupapa Peninsula in exile because they were certain that Hansen's disease was a terrible thing and you're going to have to isolate people. Same thing happened during the AIDS epidemic. So that's kind of the kinds of things that I mean. And when we let that go, certainty, then there's possibility, but that means you have to face a vulnerability. Most people don't have the stomach for that, to tell you the truth.
Anyone else? You can raise your real hand if you like.
Like Greg, maybe.
Greg.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. It helped me open some of my own thinking. I liked what you said at the end, and I'm not sure if I got it quite right, but you said something like, instead of believing in something, discover everything. I think that's what you said. So, but it's just the idea of being open to the fact that you don't have to believe in a creed or per se, but that new things will be discovered if you're willing to maybe withhold immediate judgment about what you see. That if you pause in your efforts to make sense of everything, that you can see things that you would not have otherwise seen. Is that sort of, I think, what you were trying to?
That was beautifully said, Greg. You said it really nicely.
Okay.
One final story. I know we're going to have to shift here. I was at San Francisco Zen Center once, and I happened to be in audience during a talk. I was sitting next to Robert Aiken Roshi, who at that time was probably the senior Zen teacher in the West. He was quite old, and I just happened to be sitting next to him. And someone had given a talk, and we were talking about faith and belief, and there's much discussion. And then finally, his kind of old skinny arm, which is kind of like mine now, with wrinkledy skin, he raised his hand, and they're like, "Oh, Roshi, here's the old guy raising his hand. Yes, yes." And all he said was, "In Zen, there's nothing to believe and everything to discover."
Okay.
But you got it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
All right, thank you. Thank you for gracing us with your wonderful words and thoughtful, beautiful slides, by the way, and I'm sure that's your photography. And thanks to all of you for being present. So go now and step into that unknown and pack with you love, kindness, compassion, and an open heart. This ends our service as I extinguish this candle. Mary.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Flint, once again, coming to us so early from Hawaii. Again, I'd like to reiterate your slides and your thoughtfulness, that things that you give us to think about as a fellowship. I just, we are on this pilgrimage and have been for 3 years now. And so much of what you said applies to us as individuals, but also as a fellowship. So thank you very much for that. Now is the time. If you need to go, we will do our love ritual and wish you well for the day. And if you can and would like to stay with us, we'll continue with Joan, our fabulous facilitator today, for Joys and Concerns. And then after Joys and Concerns, we'll have open community chat. So again, Flint, you're welcome to stay, but you might want to go take a nap, catch up on that early morning rise in beautiful Malachi. So let's all of us say goodbye to each other if you have to go, but stick around if you can. Love you.
A little final from me here. Temple bell. So.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Flint.